Hello and welcome back to this episode of the Product Launch Podcast. As always, I'm the host, Sean Boyce, CEO and founder of Next Step. I'd like to welcome my guest to the show, Daniel Senyard. Daniel is the co-founder and CEO of Shep. Hello, Daniel. How are you? And thanks for being on the show.
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
If you could, please tell us more about your background and how you became the founder and CEO of Shep.
Sure. So I was born in South Africa, and my intention was to become an English teacher. And so I was studying English and education in South Africa, moved over to the UK and was sort of studying in London, met an American, moved over to Santa Barbara to finish up my degree, and found out that there was no such thing as a education degree at the school I was at. That was kind of a credentialing. So I kind of started studying creative writing and kind of went from out of that into marketing roles. So I was at digital agency up in Seattle, and then moved down to Austin, Texas about 13 years ago when my wife got pregnant, and was working in marketing departments of large companies. I was going to a lot of concerts. Seattle and Austin are great for live music, and was a big live music fan, and had also been doing some freelance journalism on the side around tech. And, sort of going out to concerts, following tech, I saw this convergence of geolocation and social, where mobile phones now had cameras. This was probably about 10, 11 years ago, and had the idea for a photo sharing app. This was around about, before Instagram. Maybe it was at its bourbon phase. But I saw this opportunity for photo sharing at concerts and came up with this idea for a company called Vivo Gig, which was live music photography. It's a long story, but in summary, Instagram happened and we did not anymore. So lots of lessons learned. But that was sort of my first foray into startups. And then I joined a travel startup as a head of product. Was there for about 4 years, including a stint in New Delhi, India, after an investment, kind of working on a partnership between these two travel companies, and then founded Shep.
Yeah, thank you for sharing the background. I'll say I've been there myself as well too. And among the best lessons I've learned in product are trying to start software companies and struggling or experiencing enough challenges or ultimately having to move on to another one. I still, the first experience I had starting my own software company, my first SaaS product, that was, I would also say, largely unsuccessful. Still to this date is probably the best lesson learned, and continues to teach me more and more about how to be better moving forward. So I can certainly understand and relate. Very cool. So if you could tell us a little bit more about Shep. What is it? How did that come to be? Tell us a little bit more about the value proposition. That's a big component to what we talk about here on the show, is understanding more about software businesses' value propositions, and then we'll just kind of roll from there.
So Shep is a communication platform primarily used for compliance. So basically, it allows a company to communicate directly with employees as they engage with certain websites or when they take certain actions. So, for example, an employee might have just joined a company, or they're suddenly remote and they're having to learn how to use, the tools and the software that their company requires them to. And maybe they want to spin up a project, and they'll go to Trello and say, I used Trello at my last company. I'm going to, start up a project here. Our technology is a browser extension, and it knows that this company is meant to use Asana. So as you hit Trello, we can pop up, sort of like Intercom in the bottom corner, pop up a little notification modal that says, we use Asana for project management, click here to sign in, or pop up educational touch points. It could be a training video. It could be a form. So it's a way to sort of like create right place, right time, messages, notifications, and workflows on top of other websites. So we started off in travel, was kind of our first use case, and it was basically a way for us to pop up guidance and workflows on top of corporate travel booking flows. So usually it was employees who were searching on Expedia or Airbnb or something, and they were meant to be booking through a corporate booking tool like Concur. So it would often say, hey, you're not meant to book here, go to Concur, or it would say, make sure this is refundable or under $300 or whatever the case was. So it's a way to kind of like pop up policy prompts and training on top of these websites. Obviously, when COVID happened, that changed. So we sort of had the push away from travel of COVID, but also the pull of customers. We were working with several customers who came to us and said, we want to use this outside of travel. We want to, with procurement or training or whatever, we want to sort of increase our tool adoption and make sure people are using the right tools, storing the data in the right place. So that's when we started sort of working on more use cases than just travel.
That's definitely something I want to talk to you a little bit more about. I know we've had conversations about it before. Obviously, COVID and the pandemic has changed pretty much everything as we know it. And some businesses obviously were impacted more significantly than others. It sounds like you were working with clients specifically around their needs around travel. Since travel was severely disrupted, obviously that changed your plans. I'm curious to learn a little bit more detail about how you went through figuring out what to do once that started developing. And then you realized, as the pandemic progressed, and you realized that this wasn't going to be a temporary thing, right? What was the response from both yourself and your team? And how did you look for what you were going to become ultimately after that, or kind of preparing for your pivot? If you talk a little bit more about that, I think that'd be awesome.
Yeah. We sort of, when we launched the travel use case, we started off in much smaller companies, and we saw that usually in small companies, there was an executive assistant booking travel. And we started talking to them and finding out that their world, there was a lot of purchasing and procurement. So we'd always had in mind, beyond travel use cases, about guiding behaviors with these pop-up nudges. COVID kind of accelerated that. And so what we did was we sort of got together as a team, and there's a great book called Obviously Awesome. I'll have to look up the name of the author.
April Dunford, and she's been on the show.
That's the one. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
That was easy. So actually, after reading April's book, basically did an exercise where we looked at our capabilities and abstracted those from the market. So we said, we can know what site you're on. We can pop up, targeted context-aware notifications. And we, without the travel context, we looked at where else that would be useful, and kind of discovered this whole world of shadow SaaS, which is something I wasn't aware of, and shadow IT. So basically company data being stored in, sort of unsecure sites or being used in tools that aren't supported or approved. And, we started doing some research and trying to understand that space. But it really was a team getting together and sort of saying, where do we take this? Do we just put our heads in the sand and try and wait for travel to return? Or are we sort of unique enough and not dependent on travel that we actually have use cases outside? And as I mentioned earlier, coincidentally, within a week of us getting together to kind of do the strategy session, we had two of our customers come to us and say, while onboarding people for the travel use case, people, other team members asked, oh, this is amazing. This creates a brand new channel for us to communicate priorities to our employees. Can we use this in, one was procurement and another one was kind of onboarding. So as you're getting someone started, showing them the tools, giving them training videos, nudging them if they're going to the wrong site. So it was sort of a combo push and pull.
That always makes it easier when if you have not just one, but both, obviously. That makes a lot of sense. So at what point did you make the decision to start, how far into the pandemic, I would say, did you start saying, all right, we need to figure something out here because this is probably not going to be temporary. And as such, let's look for, like you said, investing more time into what's been suggested in April's book, which is awesome, all about product positioning and the value and impact that can have. And then it sounds like similarly or shortly thereafter, you started hearing from clients talking about new use cases. And the way you said it is also something that April talks about a lot in her book, where they fall in love with a particular use case or the value they can get out of your product. I'd love to hear more too, in terms of like, had you ever heard that before that period of time? or did it just so happen to like the timing just lined up?
Yeah, so I think I've always looked at building product kind of as a hypothesis. It's sort of, I'm an advisor to a few startups and at a few accelerators, and after, as you said, first experiences in startups, there's a lot of lessons learned, and one of the biggest lessons I learned there was not to fall in love with your product. It's really important to listen to the customer and really spend more time with the problem than the product. And so, as I said, I kind of think about product as a hypothesis. We think this solves a problem we probably understand, but not as well as we probably should on day one. And so you sort of go to market with that hypothesis and test it. And so while I don't think pivot is a dirty word, I think that a pivot is a very big change, whereas you're always making adjustments. If you're actually listening to the customers in the market, you're going to make adjustments, and call them pivots or not. That's just the way you should be building and iterating. And so we started off in the small business market, sort of SMBs, and very quickly saw all of our inbound came from large companies. And so we moved up market. We'd always anticipated small to big to multiple use cases. The sort of signals in the market just indicated that we needed to do that quicker than we planned. Now, we had kind of been going very deep on travel and building lots of travel-specific integrations and such. And what we did when COVID hit was our value prop at that time was your employees are booking on consumer sites and you don't know it, and you don't know how much they're spending until they get back after the trip. So our value prop was around what's called leakage. You need the data when people book where they shouldn't. When COVID hit, we very quickly realized that it was going to be zero leakage because no one is going to be booking anything at all. So we actually did our first kind of like COVID-related pivot right then and there, which was, that was the 13th of March. We realized that we were going to have to make an adjustment. And so instead of focusing on capturing data out of channel, we kind of focused on building a notification system on top of that capability, and realized that there was going to be a time when travel returned and that it was going to be very different. There was going to be new approval policies and rules and border restrictions and all that stuff. So we kind of made a product pivot from data capture to trigger, action triggered notifications. And so that was our first thing. We'd seen our customer base zero out, and we made that adjustment, launched a new product, and started winning a couple clients. There's not a lot of companies traveling, but we started winning some clients and pilots and such. The biggest one being Discovery, so like Discovery Channel, Animal Planet, that group. And that was the new value prop around notifications. Can you travel? Do you need a vaccination? Do you need to self-quarantine? And so that's been going, and that sort of adjustment was resonating with the market because everyone was knowing there was a return to travel coming at some point. Now with the vaccine kind of coming out, that's accelerating. But yeah, I mean, sort of was reading April's book, and we were just seeing so many clients with frozen budgets. Anything relating to travel was frozen, and we sort of like this was maybe 2 months ago or so. We're just trying to decide: do we just wait till the vaccine news comes out, or do we sort of look at the capabilities? And because as a travel startup, we're unlike a lot because we don't collect payment, we don't issue tickets. We're not a travel tool. We're sort of a part of the travel tech stack. And so we're able to say, because we're not dependent on making commissions and issuing tickets, we can have use cases outside. So it's a very long, convoluted answer, but essentially we'd always kind of looked at being flexible, having that startup mentality, being able to sort of make moves and adjustments, and have been very proactive in listening, adjusting, and evaluating.
I think that last part summarizes it well, right? And we've talked about this as well also. I like the way that you put it. How I've often referred to it as well too is thinking of your product as a fluid concept. I think people that get involved with building or starting SaaS businesses often have this vision for exactly what the product needs to be as a solution, which I think is way more dangerous. And instead, if the focus is on the problem and the customer data that you're collecting, it will become more obvious what solution makes the most sense. And like you said, thinking about it in terms of that fluid concept is also smart because you're still making a lot of assumptions, right? We're innovating, and as such, there's only so much we're going to be able to validate with data. And then we get a part of the way there, and we put something in the hands of the customers, we measure the experience. But it's all about iterating from there, right? Doesn't necessarily mean it's not as important where you start. What matters is what you do from there, like how you get the data, what you do with the data, how you make your product better, all of that kind of stuff, all the way down to and through these like external factors or something that impacts your market dramatically, right? Like a global pandemic, for example. So I think that's a great takeaway here for sure, is to just maintain that mindset regardless, right? Whether things are going well or you're experiencing additional adversity than you were expecting or whatever, that mindset will help you out along the way, obviously. And clearly it's helped you and your team. Um, the next component I was going to ask about, which is something that a lot of SaaS companies think about as well too, is as either you explicitly decide to change your target market or your target market changes over time. And you'll see a lot of information out there about, right, the SMB selling to the smaller companies versus going after some of these larger companies that you've talked about on this show so far, in the form of the enterprise customers. Can you talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of working with each group, and if you are to prepare for making some form of a transition, how you might go about doing that, and what you realistically need to be thinking about, what plans need to be in place in terms of how to do it. So any insight you can share with regard to selling to small companies versus selling to the enterprise, and anything involved with being successful with either or both, will be helpful.
Yeah, I'd say the sort of obvious difference is complexity and speed. And so with your sort of smaller companies, there's a lot less complexity in selling to them. There's fewer stakeholders, and they're able to close much faster. The challenge is that market is incredibly fragmented, and so for us trying to sell a travel product, we from the outside there's no like huge indicators that a company travels a lot. We'd sort of look at conference websites and say, okay, well, this company's exhibited X number of times. That means they have some level of travel. Whereas when you move up market, you can have very clearly defined buyer profiles. And we basically were able to go on LinkedIn and say, if there's a travel manager as a title, that means they travel enough to care, they're going to be a target. And so there was, that fragmentation versus clarity. I think that's a big factor. But then you look at the complexity of selling into enterprise, and the table stakes are huge. You really are looking at, SOC 2 compliance and, data security, encryption, having single sign-on, all that sort of stuff. And so, for us, we basically had to stop for several months and just kind of get enterprise ready. And that really included, a lot of stuff around the back end. It was kind of boring as someone with my lean towards front end product flash and fun, to be able to say, okay, no new features. This is now just about stability and doing things right and getting enterprise ready. The one thing that I'll say is a big challenge is sort of the funding perspective. As a early stage startup, selling into enterprise, we just closed a pilot with a Fortune 10 company, and that took 18 months, and so you do have to have runway. When you're used to closing a SMB client, it may be for, decimal points of what a large account is worth. The challenge is that sales cycle can take forever, and there's always a new persona popping up and sort of saying, I need to have a look at this. I need my take. And so that's another, so I'd say that there's 2 points related to that, which is make sure you have the runway to kind of follow that enterprise sales cycle, but then also really try and map it out as quickly as you can. As soon as you engage with the person you think is going to be your champion, really validate that and find out when was the last time you sort of added some sort of technology like ours. How long did that take and who was involved? And that way you can try and map out the process ahead of time to set your expectations, because it really can be quite shocking to sort of like, when we first moved into enterprise, I was like, this is great. This is going really well. I'm doing demos and people say they love it. In the SMB market, that's often all it takes for someone to give you a credit card. In enterprise, that is just the very, very, very beginning. Yeah.
I think you hit all of the critical high points there for sure. SMB, easier to make progress more quickly, typically speaking, but like you said, a fragmented market, which presents its own challenges. So kind of easier to get started, harder to get beyond that. And on the enterprise side, a lot harder to get started, but once you start to have success there, that can be a game changer of it in itself as well too. So, and therein lies some of the tricky aspects of managing from one to the other kind of thing. So, but the value and the suggestions that you provided are helpful context for people that are thinking about these in different ways. It's always helpful to understand from someone who's kind of been there, done that type thing, to know what to look out for and how to prepare yourself and your product for it.
I think something
Awesome.
else I'll mention there is just the value prop. And so, we really thought SMB was going to be it. It's this huge untapped market. Everyone who starts a travel tech company in business travel thinks they're going to conquer the, so-called unmanaged market. It's 70% of business travel spend. But our value prop was much more around compliance and data. And so you have to kind of look at that, your value prop, and who benefits from that. For us, the primary beneficiary was your CFO, your security team. It was all that sort of thing. And so having a browser extension in a smaller company means that each individual has to install it. Whereas when we moved up to enterprise, if the value prop is with the sort of higher up, top-down sales and processes, then you have an IT infrastructure that can push out your software. So if the value prop is not super strong to the employee, like a Slack or something, where the employees are going to want to install it, you probably need IT's help to push it out. And in that case, you sort of want to be upmarket. So that was a big consideration for us too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that. I almost, without thinking through all of the details of the approach, thinking about the browser extension almost feels like it would be easier for various reasons for the smaller companies rather than the larger. But having worked in enterprise myself for years, that makes perfect sense because they can kind of, because of the infrastructure management that they have and their ability to kind of roll it out to everyone. So it's basically, there's nothing for, if the end user is whoever's using a workstation to be using your product, there's nothing really necessarily for them to do from the perspective of having to install it, as opposed to, so the installation procedure for the end user in SMB would actually be more challenging.
Yeah. So it's sort of if the employee wants to use it because there's some sort of network effect at play, they're missing out on something, or they're getting some great value or productivity out of it, then that's fine. Then they will willingly install it. But if it is something that's more around policy, procedures, compliance, data security, that sort of thing, it can be quite a value, quite a challenge to try and get an individual employee to care enough about that stuff that typically isn't in their purview.
Good point. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Daniel. A couple questions for you before we let you go. The first is, are there any specific resources that you would mention on the show where other people can go to kind of learn more about anything that we talked about today?
Yeah, so from the travel side, our sort of landing page is sheptravel.com. And we put together recently a kind of white paper about returning to travel. So for companies that are looking to, say, they want to reopen their travel program, it's got some frameworks in there, how to classify what's a essential travel, what tools and procedures you need to have in place before you can consider sending people back out on the road. And then for everyone else, if you're in procurement or sort of IT, we've got getshep.io, and that's kind of got use cases and examples of non-travel examples that you can sort of see.
Thank you for sharing. Last question I have for you is, who should reach out to you and how can they get in touch?
Yeah, so I'd say, like I said, it's sort of your travel managers, definitely in the larger companies. So if you have a managed IT infrastructure and you're looking to get better compliance or better usage out of your existing tools, not wanting to have people, spending money on tools you already have, reach out. So getshep.io, or my email is daniel@sheptravel.com. And happy to talk.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here on the show, Daniel, and sharing your knowledge and experience with myself and our audience.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Product Launch Podcast powered by Next Step. If you or anyone you know is involved in scaling a B2B SaaS business, please have them reach out to me about becoming a potential guest on our show. They can email me at sean@nextstep.io. That's SEAN@nxtstep.io. This time, we'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor of our show, Next Step Consulting. Would you like to know what the right next steps are for your B2B SaaS business? Are you trying to grow and scale, but you're stuck? We can help. To find out how Next Step can help your B2B SaaS business achieve its goals, please email me, sean@nextstep.io. That's SEAN@nxtstep.io. Thanks, and keep disrupting.